Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The first light of dawn crept through the orange grove, its golden rays filtering through the leaves like whispers of a new day. Tieu Nuong rose from her mat in the small wooden house, the cool morning air brushing against her skin as she tied her faded pink shirt around her waist. The scent of citrus hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort that greeted her each morning. She stepped outside, her bare feet pressing into the soft earth, and picked up her woven basket. The orange trees, laden with fruit, stood like silent guardians, their branches sagging under the weight of the season's bounty. This grove had been her world since childhood, a place of laughter with her mother, of quiet dreams of endless toil. Now it was her refuge, her livelihood, and the keeper of her memories. Tieu Nuong moved through the rows of trees with the rhythm born of years, her hands deftly plucking the ripest oranges. Each fruit was a small sun in her palm, glowing with the warmth of the earth. She filled her basket slowly, the weight pressing against her shoulders, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She remembered her mother's gentle hands, guiding her through the grove, teaching her how to choose the best fruit. "Pick the ones that blush like the dawn," her mother had said, her voice soft as the breeze. Those days were gone, buried beneath the years and the soil where her mother now rested. Tieu Nuong was alone now, save for the grove and the man who had recently entered her life, Mr. Chung. Mr. Chung was a steady presence, a carpenter from the next village with hands roughened by wood and a smile that felt like sunlight after rain. They had met at the market on a stormy afternoon, when he'd helped her shield her oranges from the downpour. Since then he had become a constant in her life, quiet, dependable, always there with a story or a kind word. He spoke of dreams, of opening a small workshop one day, of building her a table that wouldn't wobble. "You deserve better than this old thing," he'd said, his eyes warm. Tieu Nuong had laughed, but her heart had trembled. She wanted to believe in his promises, in the life he hinted at. But she had learned long ago that promises could be as fleeting as the wind through the grove. Her basket full, Tieu Nuong hoisted it onto her back, the bamboo straps biting into her shoulders. She adjusted her conical hat and set off down the dirt path toward the village market. The morning was alive with sound, the chirping of birds, the distant hum of a motorbike, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The path wound through fields of green, past houses with thatched roofs and children playing in the dust. At the market, the air buzzed with the chatter of vendors and buyers. Tieu Nuong spread a mat on the ground and arranged her oranges in neat piles, their vibrant color drawing the eyes of passers-by. "Fresh oranges straight from the grove," she called, her voice soft but clear. She sold more than just oranges today. Some iron scraps, a few kilos of tomatoes, their red skins gleaming like jewels. 10,000 dong a kilo, uncle," she said to a customer, her smile polite but her eyes distant. The morning passed in a blur of transactions. An old woman bought oranges for her grandchildren, a young mother haggled over tomatoes, and a neighbor stopped to chat about the weather. "Tieu Nuong, when are you and Mr. Chung getting married?" the neighbor teased, her eyes twinkling. Tieu Nuong smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We'll see," she said simply, but the question lingered in her mind like a stubborn weed. She and Mr. Chung had never spoken of marriage, not directly. He was kind, dependable, but there was a part of him that felt distant, like a shadow she couldn't quite touch. She wondered if he saw her as a partner, or merely a companion to pass the time. By noon her goods were sold, more than she'd expected. The iron had fetched a good price, and the tomatoes had been a hit. Her pockets were heavier with a modest sum of money, and there was still plenty of stock left, meaning no need to import more for now. She felt a quiet relief, but it was tinged with an emptiness she couldn't name. As she walked home, the sun beat down, sweat beading on her forehead. The dirt path stretched before her, winding past the river that shimmered like a ribbon of silver. She let her thoughts drift, carried by the rhythm of her steps. She thought of Mr. Chung, of the way his laughter filled the silences in her life. She thought of her mother, of the lessons she'd left behind. And she thought of herself, of the woman she had become, strong but weary, hopeful but cautious. Back at her house, Tieu Nuong set her basket by the door and stepped into the small kitchen. The room was sparse with a single wooden table, a clay stove and a shelf of mismatched dishes. She lit the stove, the flames crackling as they consumed the dry twigs she'd gathered the day before. A pot of water went on to boil, and she pulled out a few eggs she'd bought with the money from the tomatoes. But before she could start cooking, her eyes fell on 2 red bowls she'd bought at the market. "Red bowls for the new year, lucky," she murmured, running her fingers over their smooth surface. She imagined setting the table with them, the vibrant color a small defiance against the grayness of her days. But the house was a mess, dishes scattered, dust on the floor, and she sighed. "Too much to do," she said to herself, rolling up her sleeves to clean. As she tidied the kitchen, a gnawing hunger stirred in her stomach. "I'm so hungry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. She returned to the stove where the water was now bubbling, and dropped the eggs into the pot. The scent of boiling eggs filled the air, warm and comforting, and for a moment she smiled. But as she watched the eggs bob in the water, her thoughts turned to Mr. Chung. It had been a while since he'd visited. "I wonder if he's gone far," she mused, her gaze drifting to the orange grove outside, where the sunlight danced on the leaves. "Does he think of me the way I think of him?" Her reverie was broken by a voice from the yard. "Tieu Nuong." She looked up to see Mrs. Lin, a childhood friend, standing at the gate, a bag of fruit in her hand. Mrs. Lin's smile was warm, but her eyes were shadowed with sadness. "I'm so hungry, I'm boiling eggs," Tieu Nuong said, gesturing for her friend to come inside. "Sit down, eat with me." Mrs. Lin nodded, setting the bag on the table. Inside was a small gift wrapped in red paper, a gesture that made Tieu Nuong's heart soften. "I came to visit," Mrs. Lin said, her voice trembling. "It's been so long and I've been so lonely. I needed someone to talk to." Tieu Nuong felt a pang in her chest. She knew that loneliness, the ache of an empty house, the silence that pressed against you like a weight. "I've been lonely too," she admitted, placing a hand on Mrs. Lin's shoulder. "But I'm glad you're here. Let's eat, the eggs are ready." She took the eggs from the pot, nearly burning her fingers in her haste. "I forgot about them, they're overcooked," she said with a sheepish smile, peeling the shells and splitting one in half. "Here, take this. I'm not hungry." But her eyes betrayed her, filled with a tenderness that spoke of shared sorrow. They sat together at the table, eating the eggs and sharing the fruit Mrs. Lin had brought. The fruit was fresh and sweet, a burst of flavor that made Tieu Nuong's eyes light up. "So delicious, where did you get these?" she asked. Mrs. Lin smiled faintly. "From my garden. I have vegetable flowers too, chrysanthemums with purple blooms. They're beautiful, and I'll use them for seeds next season." Tieu Nuong nodded, but her thoughts turned to her own garden. "I need to fix the shed out back," she said, her voice low. "The roof has to be repaired before the rainy season." Their conversation flowed like the river outside, simple but heavy with unspoken emotions. Mrs. Lin shared her struggles. "I've stopped peddling for a few days now. I don't know what to sell next." Tieu Nuong nodded. "I've been taking oranges to the market. It's enough to get by. Have you found a job yet?" Mrs. Lin shook her head, her eyes downcast. "Not yet. What about Kwong, my brother? Has he visited you?" Tieu Nuong smiled softly. "Sometimes. Mr. Chung said he's working as a warehouse manager for a construction company." Mrs. Lin nodded, but her gaze drifted, lost in her own thoughts. As the afternoon waned, the light in the grove turned golden, casting long shadows across the yard. Tieu Nuong looked out at her garden, where rows of greens mingled with purple chrysanthemum blooms. "So beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "Pick some to eat, they're tasty." Mrs. Lin smiled, but the sadness in her eyes remained. "I'm so lonely at home," she confessed. "I'm glad I came today. It's been so long since I've had someone to talk to." Tieu Nuong took her hand, her grip firm but gentle. "I'm glad to. Don't be sad, I'm always here. Come back when you're free." The sky began to darken, and Mrs. Lin stood to leave. "I need to feed the chickens," she said, her voice tinged with reluctance. "I'm happy to see you doing well, but I worry you're alone. Be careful of thieves." Tieu Nuong nodded, her eyes warm with concern. "You too. Be safe on your way home. Come back soon." Mrs. Lin nodded, her figure growing smaller as she walked down the dirt path. Tieu Nuong stood at the gate, watching until she disappeared. a quiet ache settling in her chest. "The fruit she brought is so sweet," she murmured, taking a bite, the flavor a small comfort against the weight of her thoughts. She turned to the garden, where the vegetable patches needed tending. Her hands moved with purpose, pulling weeds from the rows of greens, her thoughts drifting to Mr. Chung. She thought of the shed she'd rebuilt the day before, after he'd helped dismantle it for the bulldozer. She'd carried the bamboo poles and palm leaves to a new spot under the orange trees, her hands steady despite the weight. The work had kept her busy, but now, in the stillness of the evening, she felt the loneliness creep in. She wondered if Mr. Chung would return as he'd promised, with the Tet gifts he'd spoken of. The moon rose, its silver light filtering through the orange trees, casting a glow over the grove. Tieu Nuong sat on the porch, the night air cool against her skin. She looked up at the stars, their faint light a quiet promise. She thought of Mrs. Lin, of her loneliness, of the hope in her eyes as she left. She thought of Mr. Chung, of his warm smile, his words of a shared future. And she thought of herself, of the strength she carried, the love she still held despite the uncertainties. She didn't know if Mrs. Lin would return, or if Mr. Chung would bring the Tet gifts he'd promised, filling her home with sweetness and warmth. But for now she had the grove, the moonlight, and the scent of smoke from her kitchen fire. And that she knew was enough. Would Mrs. Lin find the courage to visit again? To share in the simple joys of their friendship? Would Mr. Chung return, his arms full of candies and wishes for a new year? Tieu Nuong didn't know. But as the crickets sang and the river whispered in the distance, she felt a quiet hope, a hope that, in time, the answers would come, carried on the wings of the morning light.